be done to the suspects in this case instead of violence.
Rowan's stepfather, by the way, and his friend are in jail without bond.
See, even the FBI couldn't believe such a twist. It was indeed one of the craziest cases ever whereby a girl disappeared in the middle of the night from her bedroom, and when the police began their investigation, they came across several surprising turns that nobody could have anticipated. Nobody was prepared for the reality of the girl's fate that the investigators eventually managed to unravel. This is Unsolved Files, a place where crime stories are being brought to your doorstep. What are you waiting for? Just hit the subscribe button for more fascinating and suspense-filled crime stories. Now, let's get back into this story and uncover this mystery. On April 11th, 1998, Rowan Ford was born in San Diego, California. When she was young, her parents separated, and her mother, Colleen, relocated to the little Missouri town of Stella with her. Her mother later got married to David, the man she had met. Colleen and David had a daughter together shortly after their wedding, and Colleen had many children from a previous marriage. In total, Rowan had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and they were close. Rowan, however, was outside most of the time, swimming, riding her bike about town, and pursuing her love of painting. She also enjoyed attending the Sunday school at the nearby church, where she consistently offered to assist other children who were having trouble with their assignments. In November 2007, Rowan was 9 years old and in the 4th grade at the neighborhood primary school. Her stepdad spent the majority of the day on the farm, while her mom worked the night shift at a shop. Rowan became quite independent as a result of having to fend for herself quite a bit. Meanwhile, on November 2nd, she was at home alone as usual. Her stepdad hadn't returned from the farm yet, and her mom had gone to work. When Colleen returned from her night shift the following morning, at approximately 9 in the morning, she looked in Rowan's room, but her daughter wasn't there. Colin asked her husband where her daughter was, and he replied she had asked him if she could sleep at a friend's house, and he had let her go. He said that he didn't even ask the friend's name because their town was so small and he wasn't concerned about anything happening to her. However, Colleen became concerned and decided to ask all of Rowan's friends. It didn't take long because their town just had a few streets, but her mother was even more worried because none of them had seen her and she hadn't stayed over at any of their homes. Now, despite searching the entire town, Colleen was unable to locate her daughter. When she returned home, she informed her husband that Rowan was missing and requested him to report her missing to the police. He convinced her that everything was okay and that she would return shortly. Colleen decided to take matters into her own hands and called 911 herself after waiting for Rowan for several more hours without hearing from her. The local sheriff launched a search mission right away. The sheriff, however, went to Colin's home to talk to David, since he was the last person to see Rowan before she vanished. David reported that their mutual buddy Nathan stopped by when he and his coworker Christopher were working on the property that evening. They all decided to play pool and have a few drinks at David's apartment. After stopping by the shop to buy some booze, they spent many hours at David's residence. Later that evening, they convinced David to come along so they could carry on the fun when Christopher requested Nathan to bring him home to the nearby town where his trailer was. And he went to Rowan's room to see if she was asleep before leaving the house. After making sure she was asleep, David and his pals left. And after making another trip to the store to get more booze, they went to Christopher's trailer and drank for almost an hour. David then decided to go back home and asked Nathan to drive him there. Nathan agreed, but he decided to avoid the main route and instead use back roads. He was drunk by then and didn't want to run into the cops by chance. After dropping him off, Nathan drove home, and David immediately went to bed. Rowan woke him up shortly after, asking if she could spend the night at a friend's house. He nodded mindlessly and went back to sleep. At this point, the police were starting to get suspicious of this claim. The fact that a 9-year-old girl chose to travel to her buddy's house in the middle of the night and that her stepfather allowed her to leave without even asking which friend she was referring to, baffled them the most. Although he had no proof, the sheriff thought that David might be concealing something or having a direct hand in Rowan's disappearance. The town and its environs were combed by police till late at night. More so, locals jumped into the hunt right away because they all knew Rowan's family and wanted to support them. Meanwhile, Stella's population was one with only 150 residents, so the news of Rowan's abduction quickly went throughout the county. But since nothing as such has ever happened in such a calm community, people were used to being able to let their kids play outside without fear. However, after Rowan disappeared without a trace and the police were unable to locate her for an entire day, the inhabitants of Stella were in fear. Nothing turned up on the first day of the search. When the police visited Christopher in the nearby town on November 4th, he confirmed David's account of the story. Nevertheless, Christopher did add that he had only recently learned of Rowan's absence and that his friend hadn't even gotten in touch with him since that evening. The police increased the search area and enlisted the help of more volunteers that same day, but they were still unable to locate Rowan or any leads as to where she may be. The FBI became involved in the inquiry early the following day. The investigators concentrated on looking into the possibilities of abduction, while the local police kept searching the town and its environs for Rowan. The stepfather's account looked highly questionable, thus, they had serious doubts about it. To verify that Rowan hadn't visited any of her friends that evening, the police also spoke with each of them. Meanwhile, investigators conversed with David, and he repeated different versions of his statement, adding to the suspicions against him. He provided contradictory explanations for his late return from home that evening, for instance, and even implied that Rowan might have gone to her friend's house without asking his permission. FBI officers also learned that David had asked his mother to lend him her automobile the night before Rowan vanished, something he had first refused to tell the authorities. They therefore decided to confiscate this vehicle and his pickup truck for inspection, but specialists were unable to find any proof. Since both Christopher and Nathan were with David that evening, the police decided to talk to them again. Christopher then gave the same account he had given the day before when the police invited him to the station. He also consented to a polygraph examination, which revealed no evidence of dishonesty. Christopher saw Sheriff Clark's car and waved for him to stop a few hours after he left the station and went back to work. Being the head of the Whitten Police Department, Sheriff Clark had known Christopher since he was a young boy and was 17 years old. Christopher always admired the sheriff, who was friendly with his foster parents. In trying moments, like after his mother died, he frequently turned to him for guidance or assistance. Christopher was approached by Sheriff Clark, and they talked about Rowan's disappearance. Although the Stella department was in charge of the search, the sheriff was informed of the situation but remained out of it. Throughout their talk, the sheriff thought Christopher was acting strangely, and he thought Christopher might be hiding something from him. Given that Rowan's life was in jeopardy and her whereabouts were unknown, Clark decided to inform the FBI of his suspicions. He spoke with the agents and shared his worries with them. Furthermore, investigators hypothesized that Christopher might be hiding some important details that would link Rowan's stepfather to her disappearance. Maybe he had persuaded Christopher to cover up the story of what had happened that night, and now Christopher was afraid he would be found out as an accomplice if he revealed the truth. Sheriff Clark offered to assist in getting Christopher to cooperate, telling the FBI investigators that he and Christopher had a deep and trustworthy relationship. Christopher went to Colleen's house that same evening to inquire about any updates on the hunt. FBI agents also showed up at about the same time to have another conversation with Rowan's mother. They also questioned Christopher when they spotted him there, and he reiterated that everything that had happened that evening had happened precisely as he had described. Then, he made his first mention of the possibility that David was involved in Rowan's abduction and expressed his desire to assist them in finding the truth, regardless of how awful it would be. He even recommended coming to see David and wearing a wire to attempt to get him to confess, but the detectives opted not to use such methods at that point. But rather than that, they asked Christopher to name a few possible areas where his friend might have hidden Rowan's body. And first thing the following morning, police searched these spots and also searched Stella's surroundings. David was brought in for interrogation by FBI officials once more, but he consistently denied any involvement. In an attempt to locate any leads, detectives investigated his home, but they found nothing. Christopher informed Clark about his interaction with the FBI while he was at the sheriff's office. The sheriff felt certain that Christopher was still holding something during their talk. He followed up with the detectives after their encounter, informing them that Christopher might be holding some evidence that would assist them in establishing David's guilt. The sheriff was asked to keep attempting to talk to him by FBI agents. They thought Clark wanted to give significant information, but he was afraid to share it for some reason, based on the fact that Christopher had gotten in touch with him on multiple occasions to discuss the case. On November 7th, the next day, the police summoned Christopher back to the station, requesting his permission to check his safe, which was kept in David's home. Apparently, some of Christopher's possessions were still there, and it appeared that they had lived together for a few months during a period when he was without a permanent residence. Christopher willingly provided them with a DNA sample, consented to have his trailer and car searched by the police, and promised to respond to the detectives' queries once more. They started asking him questions about that evening and wanted him to reaffirm David's account. However, this time, Christopher abruptly acknowledged that his friend's account wasn't true, and the detectives started to put pressure on him to reveal the truth. However, this pressure just made Christopher more furious. He said that he would end the interview if the police were going to treat him like a criminal and try to charge him with being involved in Rowan's abduction. Detectives were forced to terminate the questioning at that point, and Christopher left the station. He went to Sheriff Clark that same evening and told him about it. He claimed he might have to seek a lawyer and protested that the cops were treating him like a suspect. In response, the sheriff said that it was his right, but he should know that the police were only making every effort to locate Rowan. Christopher replied that he would talk to Clark exclusively going forward and that he would stop communicating with them. Christopher eventually started crying as the sheriff persuaded him to tell him what he knew. He vowed to never hurt Rowan and to always love her. He became quite close with Rowan and the other kids while he was living at David's house. He was even referred to as Uncle Christopher as they started to treat him like a member of the family. The sheriff recognized that Christopher was about to share what he knew, but before Christopher could say anything, someone came to the police station, diverting Sheriff Clark's attention for a while. Without telling the sheriff what he had wanted to say, Christopher exited the office. Clark contacted the FBI once more to report this conversation. He clarified that Christopher was nearly ready to share all he knew, but he issued a warning that pressing him too hard could make him stop talking and hire a lawyer. The detectives agreed with Clark's suggestion to give Christopher some time to consider it. A week after Rowan's disappearance, on November 9th, everything changed. The hunt for her was resumed the following day, but without success. Still, search parties managed to find a secluded spot 10 miles from Stella, close to the hamlet of Powell. They found a big hole in the earth among trees and fields. They looked there and saw Rowan's body buried beneath dirt and leaves. Everything below her waist was missing, but for a single sock. Medical professionals discovered strangulation symptoms and concluded she had been sexually assaulted in the interim. Who in the world's name could have committed such a hideous crime against a little girl? FBI agents got in touch with Sheriff Clark soon after the body was discovered and urged him to talk with Christopher once more in the hopes that he would now divulge all the information. But the sheriff discovered later that morning that Christopher had gone to the station without him and told other cops he had to talk to Clark immediately. Christopher was nowhere to be found when the sheriff started to look for him, searching all the possible locations. It went on until Christopher called Clark directly. He questioned if he was being followed and was upset. He clarified that he drove about town to clear his brain after learning of Rowan's body's discovery and saw a gray automobile following him. In response, Sheriff Clark said he was unaware of any surveillance and recommended that Christopher and himself meet in person. Christopher showed signs of nervousness and stated worries about his safety when they first met. Could Christopher be the man behind Rowan's disappearance? After Rowan's body was found, Christopher thought he might be charged with murder and that someone might take revenge on him. It was time to come clean, Clark told him as they were in the station, because the case had been reclassified as a homicide. Once more breaking down in tears, Christopher was requested to tell the sheriff what David had done to Rowan. Christopher replied that he didn't want to talk about it here, because there were too many people at the police station. He recommended that they go somewhere more peaceful and pointed out a little bridge that was a few miles from their town. After Clark gave his okay, the two of them drove there. Unexpectedly, Christopher lifted his hands and told him that he needed to handcuff him as they stepped out of the car. Shockingly, the sheriff argued that it wasn't necessary, but Christopher countered that you would have to do it in light of what I had informed you. Following this, he started speaking, telling the police the same story he had told them several times in the first place. He went to his trailer with Nathan and David, where they carried on their drinking. After a while, David asked Nathan to give him a ride when his buddies decided to go home. They departed after promising to use detours to escape the cops. The sheriff was completely taken aback by what Christopher then began to say. He immediately devised a plan and declared his desire to sexually abuse Rowan. He got into his car and went directly to David's house, through the main highway, knowing that his companions would need some time to make their way through the fields. To keep Rowan from waking up, he went into her room, grabbed her up, and carried her to his car. He then led her to his trailer and attacked her there. He claimed that she had only just woken up and had made an effort to resist, but had been unsuccessful. Not wanting Rowan to know he was the one, Christopher didn't talk to her or switch on the lights. He had intended to take her back home and leave after the crime, but events transpired differently. The moon shone brightly when he took Rowan out of the trailer, and she saw his face. In a state of panic, Christopher took hold of a rope and choked her. He carried her body into the car after she died, and then began to consider what to do. Initially, Christopher planned to throw her off the bridge, the same one where he and Sheriff Clark were standing, but he knew that her body would be discovered too soon. So he got in his car and started around the area while thinking of alternative options. He soon went to the nearby town after remembering the big pit there. Everything fell inside as he threw the body into the pit and attempted to cover it with branches since the pit was too big. Christopher recognized he needed to get rid of Rowan's panties and the rope he used to kill her when he returned to the trailer and discovered bloodstains on his mattresses and clothes. To burn them all, he gathered them all and put them in a big barrel. Christopher dragged the barrel inside the shed, shut the door, and lit the fire thereafter, realizing very quickly that such a fire would undoubtedly draw attention. It's shocking to say that this story utterly surprised Sheriff Clark. He had assumed David was the criminal all along and that Christopher was only hiding some facts from him. He found it difficult to accept the man he had known for nearly 20 years was capable of such cruelty. Despite not living with them following his divorce from his wife, Christopher was the father of 3 children. To him, he had always seemed like a good man, but the truth was far more terrifying. Christopher did not get handcuffed by the sheriff since he willingly consented to go to the station after telling his story. The sheriff didn't tell the FBI investigators again until after they got there, and he was then taken into custody on murderous suspicions. Additionally, Christopher permitted his car and trailer to be searched voluntarily. But why did the detectives not put much effort into the search? Why weren't the car and trailer searched earlier, as he demanded? He concluded his confession by saying that he felt bad about what he had done, and that the following day, he had cried uncontrollably. David was contacted right away by the detectives to let him know that Christopher had admitted to the crime. They believed David might have been working as a go-between for his friend because of his peculiar actions and contradictory claims. But an even more startling turn was waiting for them. David abruptly altered his account of what happened when he was brought in for questioning. He claims that he became suspicious that Christopher might have abducted Rowan the night he got home and saw her absent from her room. He then proceeded to Christopher's trailer using his wife's vehicle. The girl was on the bed, and Christopher was bending over her when he entered. David chose to participate rather than save Rowan. He also sexually assaulted her before assisting his companion in killing her and disposing of the body. What kind of a horrible stepfather would do that? For crying out loud, she was only a child. Well, David went on to say that during the event, his brain just shut down, leaving him with no memory of the night lasting several days. Unexpectedly, the detectives went back to Christopher to get David's words verified. However, Christopher insisted that everything went exactly as he had told them, and that his friend was not involved. The investigators were still perplexed by this, but Christopher's account fit the evidence. Medical professionals verified that the victim had been strangled with a tiny rope. a fact that the murderer would only be aware of. An ash-filled barrel was discovered by the police when they searched the trailer. They also found hair similar to Rowan's in his car. Both individuals made incriminating remarks, but investigators are still unable to conclude with confidence which account of events was accurate. Thus, the cases were sent to court, and David was also taken into custody. Christopher attempted to have all of his comments removed from the case file during the trial, arguing that the police had violated his rights and that he was not aware they might be used against him. However, the judge rejected this request because Christopher had given his consent for all of the interactions with the investigators. Christopher was also tempted to argue that his rough upbringing served as a mitigating circumstance. He was moved between foster and birth parents from a young age, which significantly affected him. Christopher also invited a specialist who said he showed indicators of developmental problems. However, none of this prevented him from being punished. 5 years after the murder, in 2012, he received a death sentence. He unsuccessfully attempted to appeal this punishment. Regarding David, the matter was considerably more convoluted. While he acknowledged abusing and killing Rowan, there was a major discrepancy between his story and Christopher's assertions. If the prosecution chose to charge David with murder, it might result in the reversal of Christopher's sentence and David's escape from accountability. The prosecution was unable to take such a chance because David was not the subject of any conclusive evidence, such as DNA. As a matter of fact, they were still unsure of his involvement. Although there was little evidence to back up this argument, the prosecution did not completely rule out the idea that David and Christopher had actually committed the crime jointly. Ultimately, a challenging choice was made. They dropped David's charges to far lesser ones to minimize the possibility that Christopher's sentence would be reversed. Both child endangerment and obstruction of justice were the counts he entered a guilty plea to. He received an 11-year prison sentence, with at least 5 of those years to be spent behind bars. Outrage exploded upon hearing this sentence. If David had indeed participated in the murder, his penalty was thought to be excessive given the seriousness of the crime. He probably won't be tried for this matter again, but there is currently nothing that can be done about it. Regarding Christopher, he is still incarcerated and awaiting execution because there is no assurance that the death penalty will ever be carried out, and decades frequently elapse between sentencing and execution. Probably, he will just remain imprisoned for the remainder of his life. What a twist of events, and indeed one of the craziest cases ever. But what do you think of David? Is he just acting up, or there is more to it? Let us know in the comment below. Also, check out our previous video.